will continue to pay tribute to some of the thriving African American cities and towns that were deliberately destroyed in the US. During the Red Summer of 1919, racial tensions came to a boiling point when a young black boy drifted into a white-only area of Lake Michigan. How did such an innocent act lead to days of bloodshed and eventually to more formal separation between blacks and whites? Welcome to the Sankofa Pan-African series. Please support us through Patreon and by buying me coffee so we can continue to bring you this series. Subscribe if you've not yet done so, and please turn on your notification button so you know when we have new episodes. Of course, share our videos with your contacts. By the end of the First World War, racial friction became intensified when large numbers of African Americans continued to migrate north in search of livelihoods which were blatantly denied them in the South. Most white people resented their moving in on their cities in the North to compete for work and housing. Between 1910 and 1920, the black population of the city of Chicago, for instance, increased from 44,000 to more than 100,000. So, urban ghettos were overcrowding, and black veterans who had served their country to preserve democracy were not shy about demanding equality. The migrations did not reduce violence unleashed on them in the South, as the Ku Klux Klan continued to rampage there, which it resulted in 64 lynchings in 1918 and 83 in 1919, and race riots broke out in Washington, D.C., Knoxville, Tennessee, Longview, Texas, and Phillips County, Arkansas. In the North, terrible race riots also erupted in Chicago and in Omaha, Nebraska. The Chicago riots broke out in July 1919 after a black teenager on a raft drifted into a swimming area that was unofficially designated as a whites-only area of Lake Michigan. He was stoned and deliberately drowned by a white man. Although his killing was by a white man was observed and reported, the police refused to arrest the white guy. The members of the black community at the beach got angry and fighting broke out. Very quickly, distorted rumors about the fight swept through the city, and sporadic fighting broke out between both races. The fight at the beach was simply like a match which ignited the already racially charged city, and racial violence which then lasted 13 days. At the end of it, although officially only 38 deaths were recorded, with 23 black and 15 whites killed, 1,000 black families were rendered homeless as a result of the riots. The riots also led to the city being more racially divided than it was before the outbreak of violence. It is believed that in the aftermath of World War I, during which an estimated 350,000 African Americans enlisted, there was a lot of tension between blacks and white Americans because the black people were determined to fight for their basic civil rights. The tensions reached a tipping point, leading to what most white newspapers declared as race riots, which broke out in over 2 dozen cities. However, most scholars agree that Elaine Arkansas, the carnage in Elaine, Arkansas, was one of the worst examples of the length to which white supremacists would go to ensure that black people remained subjugated. Now, Elaine was a typical southern rural town where slavery had only ended in name only. Black people remained enslaved through a system of sharecropping, which forced black farmers, often including entire families with very young children, to work and produce crops through a process that was rigged to keep them enslaved by indebtedness. For several decades, the system went unchecked. However, during the fall of 1918, a black farmer in Arkansas decided to form a union to protect himself and his peers from the blatant exploitation by their white landowners. On the 9th of September 30th, 1919, some of the sharecroppers who had signed on to the union gathered in Phillips County in Arkansas to plan. Of course, they knew it was dangerous for them to congregate and plan for their basic rights. So, they had about 6 of them stand guard with rifles and shotguns in front of the door of the place where they were meeting. While the men were inside the meeting, a car filled with white guys arrived at the venue where the meeting was being held. Shots were exchanged between the men in the car and the men who had been placed as on sentry duty by the union members. And a white man was killed as a result of the exchange. The other white people who escaped quickly spread the rumor that the black sharecroppers had started an uprising and that they were out for white blood. The white community then gathered themselves, and before you knew it, the black people were under attack. The sharecroppers, looking to protect themselves, quickly formed self-defense groups. Unfortunately, by the following morning, under the supervision of the sheriff, Frank Kitchens, and his deputies, the carnage began really, seriously. Black people were shot indiscriminately, including women and children. Their houses were burnt. The black community, which had a number of veterans amongst them, tried to hold their own against the white mob. The mobs were not just killing and burning, but they were also looting their shops and taking black body parts, ears, fingers, as souvenirs. The mobs deliberately sought out prosperous black families to annihilate them. Within two days, 500 US troops were sent to quell the so-called Black Uprising. When they got there was no shooting going on because the black people had been driven into hiding while hundreds of white men with guns were rampaging around the streets. One of the most tragic parts of this carnage was that many of the black men who were former soldiers had hidden in bushes for safety. But on sighting the federal troops, they believed that they were there to stop the violence. So they came out. But they were met by a barrage of shots from the machine guns of the federal troops. While hundreds of black men, women, and children were killed, only 5 white men lost their lives in that carnage. Hundreds of African Americans were rounded up and put in jail, and when the jail could no longer contain them, they locked them up in the schoolhouse. Those who were arrested were tortured by being whipped, shocked with electric charges, made to inhale formaldehyde in order to force them to confess that they had been part of a black uprising. When they were finally taken to court, they were not allowed to consult with any attorneys. Many of them were indicted, and an all-white jury quickly convicted them to the cheers of the mobs that gathered outside the courthouse. 12 of them were sentenced to die. But fortunately, the NAACP was able to step in, and the case went to the Supreme Court, which exonerated them, and they were released in 1925. Now, although some survived this bloodshed, this was another black community that was devastated, thoroughly devastated. Thanks for watching. Please support us through Patreon and by buying me coffee so we can continue to bring you this series. Subscribe if you've not, and turn on your notification buttons. Please don't forget to share our videos with all your contacts and keep those comments coming.